The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Natalie Hayes pushed through the trauma bay doors at 11:02 p.m., her scrub still damp from the evening rain, her badge clipped to her pocket at the exact same angle it had been for 3 years. The smell hit her first, antiseptic layered over something older, something that lived in the walls of places where people came apart. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light. She didn't look at anyone. She never did. The night shift was a choreography she'd learned in a different language, in a different country, in a different life. The hierarchy here was simpler than what she'd known in Ramadi, but the principle was identical: know your rank, move invisibly between the gaps, and never, ever draw attention from the people who signed the paychecks. She'd been doing it for 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 years of 12-hour shifts, 3 years of catching what the residents missed, 3 years of dissolving into the background noise of beeping monitors and overhead pages. The trauma bay at 11:08 p.m. operated like a machine with too many hands on the controls. 2 residents were arguing about a femur fracture in trauma 2. A surgical intern was staring at an EKG like it might suddenly translate itself into English. Nurses moved between patients with the efficiency of people who'd learned to prioritize oxygen over politeness. The charge nurse, Patricia, glanced at Natalie without seeing her, a brief flicker of acknowledgement that meant nothing. Natalie had become good at that kind of nothing. She moved to the medication dispensary to relieve the day shift nurse, Maria, who was already pulling off her gloves with the relief of someone whose ordeal was ending. The locked cabinet opened with a click. Natalie began the count, a ritual of verification that should have taken 15 minutes and meant nothing. Morphine vials. Fentanyl patches. Propofol for sedation. Each item logged, each number checked against the electronic record. This was the work that no one saw, the invisible architecture that kept the whole operation from collapsing into chaos. The numbers didn't match. Natalie's hand stilled. She recounted. Fentanyl, supposed to have 17 vials. 17 in the log. She physically counted. 16 sat in the cabinet. She set them on the counter and counted again, slowly, separating each vial with the tip of her index finger. 16. The discrepancy sat there between them like a question she wasn't supposed to ask. Maria, she said quietly. Her voice came out level, the kind of voice that belonged to someone with nothing riding on the answer. Fentanyl count is off by 1. Maria looked up from shoving her belongings into a locker. She was tired. Everyone was tired. Probably Johnson used 1 and forgot to log it. He does that. It's in the electronic record as 17. Then probably it's a count error from yesterday. Maria's tone suggested this conversation was beneath the both of them, which might have been true. Log it as 17 and move on, Natalie. No one cares about 1 vial. But Natalie Hayes had stood in a compound in Ramadi in 2003 and counted ammunition while mortar rounds converted the building next door into pieces. She'd learned that numbers, when they didn't add up, told you something was wrong. It was a small skill. It had kept her alive. She found Dr. Marcus Hargrove in the resident lounge, where he was reviewing a chart with his reading glasses perched on his nose like a man who wanted to look thoughtful. Hargrove was tall in a way that suggested he'd never had to prove it, wealth-coded, confident in the way people are when doors have opened their whole lives. 61 years old, married to someone with a yacht club membership, medical director of the trauma bay because someone had believed his credentials and his manner without questioning either very hard. He looked up as Natalie entered, and his expression shifted from neutral to something that resembled acknowledgement without actually containing any. Dr. Hargrove, she said. She kept her voice small. Professional. Deferent. I have a question about the medication count. The fentanyl is fine, he said. He didn't look up from the chart. The count is fine. The electronic log shows 17. The physical count this evening was 16. Hargrove set down his pen with the deliberation of a man placing an exclamation point at the end of a sentence he'd decided not to say aloud. He removed his glasses and looked at her directly, and Natalie saw something in his eyes that she recognized from other lives in other places, the particular contempt of someone who had never been questioned by someone they'd learned to see as invisible. "Nurses do the physical count," he said. "Electronic counts are managed by pharmacy. If there's a discrepancy, pharmacy handles it." "Is pharmacy handling it?" "I haven't called pharmacy yet. I wanted to clarify with you first. Then call pharmacy. That's the chain of command." He picked his glasses back up and returned his attention to the chart, which was his way of ending the conversation. "Unless you have a question about treatment protocols, I don't think we have anything else to discuss." Natalie stood there for a moment longer than she should have. The moment itself became a mistake. She felt Hargrove's attention tighten around her like a question he'd already answered, and she understood, with the kind of clarity that came from having survived in places where nuance was the difference between breathing and not breathing, that she'd just made her first error at Oak Creek Memorial in 3 years of careful nothing. She left the lounge and found the break room, where she was supposed to sign out. The room was empty except for the industrial refrigerator and a coffee maker that had been running so long it had achieved a kind of philosophical stasis. Natalie sat in one of the plastic chairs and pulled out her phone, though she didn't do anything with it. The phone stayed dark. This was what she did now when the shift ended and she was alone. She sat in break rooms that smelled like other people's lunches and cold brewing equipment, and she didn't call anyone or text anyone or reach out to anyone, because that was part of the agreement. You disappeared. You didn't resurface. You didn't remind anyone that you'd ever existed in the first place. At 11:58 p.m., she went to her locker to collect her things. The locker was in the back corner of the staff room, metal the color of institutional beige, her name printed on a label in someone else's handwriting. She opened it and found the single item she'd kept from before, the pair of worn combat boots, laced with paracord the color of dried blood. The leather had cracked and weathered in a way that suggested years in places where rain came sideways and the ground was never what it appeared to be. The soles had been resoled twice. She'd kept them because throwing them away felt like a question she couldn't answer, and she'd come to Oak Creek Memorial to stop asking questions altogether. Natalie reached in and touched the leather. It was warm from being sealed in the locker, and smooth in the places her hands had held them most often. The combat boots were marked with dust from a desert that officially didn't exist on any map she'd ever filed, carrying a person she'd been ordered never to become again. She kept them because they weighed almost nothing and took up almost no space, and because some part of her, the part that had learned to count ammunition in darkened compounds and move through dust storms without making sound, believed that you didn't throw away the only evidence that you'd ever been anything other than exactly what you appeared to be. She closed the locker door and headed for the parking lot. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial stretched into its third hour when Dr. Marcus Hargrove rounded the corner of Trauma Bay 4, where Natalie was repositioning a gunshot victim's left shoulder for better imaging access. The patient's family clustered near the doorway, a mother with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles had turned the color of old bone, 2 adult sons standing rigid against the wall. Hargrove's voice cut through the quiet like a surgical blade finding resistance. "Natalie!" A word. She straightened, turned to face him, her expression already neutral. Hargrove's face held the particular shade of red that meant he'd been waiting for this moment. He stepped into the trauma bay proper, positioning himself between her and the family so they had an unobstructed view of what was about to happen. Someone on the night shift always texted. Someone always watched. Your triage assessment on this patient, he gestured at the gunshot victim without looking at him, was fundamentally flawed. You coded him as priority 2 when his presentation screamed priority 1. That's 3 minutes he lost. 3 minutes this family lost. Do you understand the danger of being careless? Of cutting corners? Natalie didn't respond. Her hands remained at her sides. One measured breath in. The fluorescent lights above hummed their constant 60-cycle drone, a sound she'd learned to filter out years ago. A sound that had no place in compounds where generators ticked and died and left only silence and the wind through broken walls. I've reviewed your nursing file, Hargrove continued, his voice lower now, more theatrical. 3 years at this hospital and you've maintained an almost suspicious level of invisibility. No commendations. No leadership initiatives. Just showing up. Shifting blame when things don't work out. It's exactly the kind of mediocrity that costs lives, and frankly, I'm surprised administration hasn't asked you to consider whether night shift nursing is really your calling. The mother's eyes had shifted from her son to Natalie. One of the sons looked away. Hargrove smiled, a thin, satisfied thing, and turned to leave as if the conversation had simply ended. I've seen better men than you break under far less weight, Doctor. The words came out quiet. Not angry. Not defensive. Just a statement of fact, the way someone might observe that the rain was wet. Hargrove stopped walking. His shoulders went rigid. He turned back slowly, and for one extended moment, Natalie met his gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things that would unmake most people. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just stood there in her scrubs with her hands at her sides, her voice still level. That's entirely inappropriate. You asked if I understood, Doctor. I do. He left. The family didn't make eye contact as Natalie returned her attention to their son, adjusting the fall line with mechanical precision. Her hands were steady. There was no tremor. There was no heat in her face. There was only the next task, and the one after that, and the knowledge that some people spent their whole lives trying to break others because they'd never learned how to build anything. The second shift was worse because it was designed to be. Natalie entered the break room at 3:17 a.m. carrying a Tupperware container with leftovers from Sunday, grilled chicken, brown rice, steamed broccoli. The room held 5 nurses from the day shift overlap, all of whom had been scheduled through until 7 a.m. They were seated around the small break table, talking quietly, eating their own meals. When Natalie's shadow crossed the threshold, one nurse stood. Then another. Then the other 3 rose in sequence, each gathering their trash, their personal items, their dignity, and filing past her without speaking. One left a half-finished coffee cooling on the table, steam still rising faintly from the cup. She sat alone at the table. Opened her container. The chicken was still cold from refrigeration. She ate mechanically, each bite exactly like the last one, while the hum of the vending machine's compressor filled the silence. 15 minutes passed this way. 20. Her phone didn't buzz. No one texted. No one looked in through the break room window. She simply existed in the room the way things exist in locked storage, present but irrelevant. When she finished, she rinsed her container in the sink, dried it, and returned to the floor. The bulletin board was positioned at the main nursing station, covered in the usual detritus of hospital notices, vaccination reminders, staff birthday celebrations, a flyer for a grief counseling group that met on Thursdays. Natalie found the write-up at 4:52 a.m., posted at eye level, her full name centered at the top of a standard disciplinary form. The date was from her shift 3 days ago. The violation listed was failure to follow chain of command in clinical decision-making. Hargrove's signature was present. The HR stamp was official. It was there for anyone coming through the station to read, and people always read the bulletin board. It was human nature. Shame required an audience. She read it once. Didn't touch it. Didn't tear it down. Simply registered the information the way she might register a patient's lab values, data collected, processed, filed away. Someone had seen her reading it. She felt their eyes move away quickly, embarrassed to have been caught witnessing her humiliation. Hargrove passed her in the hallway near the supply room at 5:41 a.m. He was carrying a stack of charts. He offered her a thin smile, the kind of smile a snake might make if snakes had facial muscles. The smile of a man who believed he'd successfully begun dismantling someone piece by piece. His eyes held the glitter of satisfaction. Natalie didn't smile back. She simply held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she'd seen exactly what he was doing, and then she stepped around him to retrieve the 4 access supplies she needed. But what he didn't account for was that 3 years of invisibility had allowed her to document everything. 3 years of watching. 3 years of keeping meticulous mental notes about the medication counts that didn't reconcile, the phantom procedures that appeared on charts for patients who'd never received them, the kickback arrangements with medical suppliers that Hargrove's network had seamlessly woven into the fabric of Oak Creek Memorial's operations. She'd kept her head down because she'd been taught to keep her head down, because the woman she'd been before the boots went into the locker knew that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was see something without permission. What he didn't know was that 3 years of silence had made her the most informed person in the hospital about his crimes. What he didn't understand was that she'd accepted the invisibility, absorbed the insults, swallowed the humiliation because she'd learned long ago that patience was a weapon and observation was a form of warfare. And that's when the intercom crackled to life with a tone that changed everything. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. ETA, Ambulance Trauma 2:58 minutes. The night shift moved like water responding to pressure. 3 nurses converged on the bay. A respiratory therapist materialized from the hallway. Hargrove was already moving, already calling for the crash cart, already positioning himself at the head of the bed where he could command the room. The patient arrived 173 seconds later, a construction worker with a crush injury to the lower abdomen, bleeding already visible through the dressing, his blood pressure 64 systolic and dropping. Hargrove called for 2 large-bore 4s and began speaking the language of crisis management with the kind of authority that made people listen. The problem was that his authority was a surface thing. The problem was that Natalie, standing at the opposite side of the trauma bed, had actually seen what a crush injury looked like and what it required and what the particular pattern of bleeding indicated about which vessels had been compromised. "We need a Reboa catheter through the femoral," she said quietly. "I've got this, Natalie." Hargrove didn't even look at her. "Get me 4 units of ONEG and set up for a rapid infuser." She moved. 4 units appeared within 50 seconds. She placed them into the level 1 rapid infuser and set the flow rate to maximum. But her eyes stayed on the patient's abdomen, on the angle of the bleeding, on the specific pattern that meant his body was a clock counting down. She'd seen this before. Not in this bay. Not with monitors and medications and people trained to intervene. She'd seen this in a compound that no longer existed, holding a child whose intestines were spilling into her hands while mortar fire restructured the building around them. The flatline beep cut through the noise like a scream. Desert dust. Copper blood. The smell of diesel fuel mixing with something sweeter, human tissue burning. Incoming, incoming. The radio screaming numbers she couldn't process because her hands were full, her hands were occupied with a child's body, and the compressor rounds were hitting the east wall like punctuation marks on a sentence she didn't want to finish. The little boy's eyes were open. The little boy was asking her something in Arabic and she didn't have a translation for what she was about to do. There was no word for it. There was only the next breath, the next action, the next impossible thing required of hands that belonged to someone she'd been before this morning, before this month, before this country had its teeth. She blinked. The desert was gone. The trauma bay reassembled itself around her. Oxygen saturation on the monitor read 58 and plummeting. The patient was transitioning into full cardiac arrest. Hargrove was frozen, actually frozen, his hands suspended over the patient's abdomen as if he'd forgotten what motion was. Natalie moved. The code blue crashed into cardiac tamponade at 2:19 a.m., and Natalie moved before Hargrove finished freezing. Her hands were already reaching for the spinal needle, the 18-gauge angiocath already in her palm like muscle memory had its own pulse. The patient's neck veins distended like bridge cables about to snap. His blood pressure had collapsed to 62/38. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, fighting against something no machine could solve alone. Hargrove stood paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed. Nothing came out. Spinal needle. Now. Natalie's voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed in rooms where hesitation killed people. The resident, a thin young man named Chen, moved. Grabbed it. Handed it over with trembling fingers. Natalie didn't look at Hargrove. Didn't acknowledge his frozen state. She prepped the patient's chest with iodine, found the 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line, and pressed the needle through skin and muscle and membrane. The hiss of air escaping. The room held its breath. Blood filled the syringe. Dark and urgent and wrong. Pericardial fluid, the liquid tomb compressing his heart from the outside. Pressure? Natalie asked. 68 and dropping, the cardiac nurse answered. The needle went deeper. Another syringe. More blood. The patient's eyes opened suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch inside his chest. His hand grabbed at the air. "You're okay," Natalie said. Not to comfort him. Information. Data. Blood around your heart. Releasing it now. O2 sat climbing, 62. 68, 74. 79, 85. 91, stable. His hand found her wrist. Gripped it like an anchor. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Her hand steady as a surgical laser, she held the syringe and let him hold her, and something in her eyes, something ancient and practiced and terrible, looked directly into his eyes and said without words, "I know exactly what you're feeling. I've been there. You're going to survive this." The monitor beeped. Sinus rhythm. Actual rhythm, not the chaotic electrical storm from 3 minutes ago. "Get me a chest tray," Natalie said. "We need imaging before the tamponade reaccumulates. He's got a stab wound somewhere. Deep penetration. I want to know how deep." The team moved. Moved. Not because Hargrove ordered anything. Because the woman in the blue scrubs had just executed a procedure that required the kind of precision and calm that lives are built on, and everyone in that trauma bay knew they'd just watched something they'd only read about in textbooks. Chen was staring at her. Not at the monitor. At her. The patient's hand was still on her wrist, and she was still looking at him, and there was something in her expression, recognition, maybe, or the memory of recognition, as if she'd held this man's eyes in a moment of crisis before and knew exactly how to bring him back from the edge. Hargrove stepped backward. His face had gone the color of old bone. Natalie turned to him. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. "I need a trauma surgeon on standby. Non-negotiable. Call now." It wasn't a request. It was a command. He made the call. The next 15 minutes dissolved into controlled chaos, imaging, labs, for lines, blood products, the kind of orchestrated emergency that separates competent trauma teams from people who wear white coats and pray nobody asks them to actually save a life. Natalie moved through it like she was reading a map written on the walls, calling out orders in terminology that made Chen's eyes widen, instructing the team on evac priority and field protocols that sounded like something from a classified briefing, not a Norfolk trauma bay at 3 in the morning. Get him to surgery. Cardiac surgery first, not general trauma. They need to rule out coronary involvement before we touch that stab wound. This isn't a guess. This is protocol. Protocol. She'd said protocol like she'd written it. The trauma surgeon, a woman named Reeves who'd trained at Bethesda and knew the difference between theory and the kind of medicine practiced in places where you didn't have time for second attempts, listened to Natalie's handoff and nodded once. Just once. "You done field dressing for penetrating thoracic trauma?" Reeves asked. Natalie didn't answer. Didn't need to. Reeves nodded again. To herself. Then, good. Because this guy's lucky you were standing in that trauma bay instead of somewhere else. The patient was wheeled to the elevator. His hand released her wrist an inch at a time, as if letting go might mean he'd slip back into whatever darkness had nearly claimed him. Natalie watched him go. Her face was perfectly still. The kind of still that comes from having witnessed too many people wheeled away and surviving only because you've learned not to feel the full weight of it in real time. 3 minutes after the doors closed, security arrived at the trauma bay with their hands on their belts, asking if anyone needed medical attention. From what? Natalie asked. Code 6 was called. Armed individual, possible weapon. We got a report of a disturbance. The room exchanged glances. Hargrove had gone very quiet in the corner. His phone was in his hand. His thumb was moving across the screen like it belonged to someone else. No disturbance, Natalie said. Patient had a psychiatric crisis secondary to his injury. Presented as agitated. We de-escalated verbally. No physical altercation, no weapon discharge, no injury to staff. It was precise. It was professional. It was a lie wearing the costume of truth. Security looked at the patient's stretcher, still wet with iodine and blood. Looked at the syringe full of dark fluid. Looked at Natalie, and something in her posture made them decide that whatever had happened in this room, it had been handled by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. They left. The trauma bay fell silent except for the residual beeping of machines powering down. The iodine smell hung in the air like a ghost. Chen was still staring at her. His name tag said RN under his photograph, which meant he'd been in school, probably, when Natalie was doing something that couldn't be talked about in schools. How did you know? He asked quietly. About the cardiac tamponade. How did you know it was there? Natalie pulled off her gloves. One, then the other. The sound was louder in the quiet. She didn't answer him. Instead, she looked at Hargrove, who was standing in the corner with his phone still in his hand, and her eyes, those ancient, practiced, terrible eyes, held absolute clarity about who would remember this moment and who would forget, and exactly how much damage control was about to begin. She walked past him without speaking. Her boots made a sound on the tile floor, step, step, step. The kind of sound that comes from someone who knows how to move through hostile territory and hasn't lost the rhythm of it yet. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the patient's hand, still reaching out from memory as they'd wheeled him away. The way he'd looked at her like she'd come back from the dead to save him. The way his eyes had held the kind of recognition that only exists between two people who've seen things that break people in ordinary circumstances, and survived them anyway, together. The needle slid in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Natalie's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this in a compound in Ramadi with nothing but a field pack and a prayer. The spinal needle, 14 gauge, 1.5 inches of steel, punctured the pericardial sac with a soft resistance that only she seemed to hear over the chaos of the trauma bay. Blood. Dark, deoxygenated blood that had no business being there, pooling around a heart that was running out of time. The syringe plunger pulled back. Air escaped from the pericardium with a hiss that sounded like a held breath finally released. Red fluid filled the chamber. 20 milliliters. 40. The needle stayed steady in her hands while the man's body gasped for oxygen it could finally reach. O2 climbing, she said. Not a request. A statement. The monitor beeped its acknowledgement. 78. 84. 90. His eyes opened. They found her face with the intensity of someone coming back from the edge of a cliff, and in that moment, recognition flickered behind the pain. Not confusion. Not the unfocused stare of a man in shock. Recognition. The kind that only lies between two people who've shared the specific gravity of survival, who've stood in the same hellfire and walked out together. Senior Chief, he whispered. His hand grabbed her wrist. The grip of a man who'd been drowning and just found the only piece of driftwood in the ocean. Natalie pulled her hand away, clean and professional, and continued the evacuation. 60 more milliliters. The heart squeeze became stronger with each withdrawal of blood that wasn't supposed to be there. The monitor stabilized into a rhythm that looked almost like hope. Sinus rhythm, she announced. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of people watching someone do the impossible with the calm of someone making coffee. The nurses stepped out from behind the equipment they'd been hiding behind. The resident who'd frozen stood there, his gloved hands hanging useless at his sides. Even the respiratory tech stopped moving, mid-adjustment of the ventilator. Dr. Hargrove stood at the far end of the trauma bay, his face the color of old drywall. He watched Natalie secure the needle with a piece of tape, watched her check the patient's pupils, watched her do every single thing he should have done in the first 30 seconds and didn't. His phone was already in his hand. By 8:41 p.m., he was on the deck of the hospital board chairman's yacht in the Elizabeth River, the sunset painting everything gold except for his face, which had gone the shade of old concrete. The call lasted for minutes. The message was shorter: Senior Chief Hayes is unstable. A liability. She engaged an armed assailant instead of following protocol. She's a danger to staff and patients. By 9:22 p.m., he'd called 3 references, military contacts he'd cultivated, people whose names didn't quite check out, people who owed him money or favors. They all said the same thing: erratic. Unpredictable. Not someone you'd want in a hospital. The fabrications layered on top of each other like sediment, building a narrative that would be impossible to dig out once it hardened. By 9:51 p.m., an HR investigator named Patricia Vance arrived at the hospital. She had the kind of face that came from country club membership and the kind of walk that came from knowing she didn't have to convince anyone of anything. Her presence was the conviction. Hargrove met her in his office. The investigator listened to his account of how Natalie had recklessly endangered the trauma bay by directly confronting an armed assailant instead of calling security, how she'd put her own heroics above protocol, how her behavior suggested a pattern of instability. Patricia took notes. Her pen moved like it was writing scripture. By 10:13 p.m., Natalie was called to a meeting on the 3rd floor. She knew before she walked in what was happening. The body language of the security officer waiting outside her locker. The way the night supervisor had looked at her when she handed over the message. The specific quality of dread that comes not from surprise but from recognition. This was how it always ended. Not with bang but with bureaucracy. Not with gratitude but with paperwork. They sat her in a grey conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and stale coffee. Hargrove didn't attend, that would have been too obvious. Instead, there was Patricia Vance and an HR representative and a hospital security director, and they explained to her that her actions tonight, while perhaps well-intentioned, constituted a serious breach of protocol. She had engaged a potentially dangerous individual. She had not waited for security. She had created a dangerous situation. "I saved his life," Natalie said. "You created a liability," Patricia answered. Her pen tapped once against her notepad. "That's the legal distinction." It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed up in committee language. Natalie was being terminated for cause, effective immediately. Her badge would be deactivated. Her locker would be cleared by security. She was to leave the premises within the hour. Natalie nodded once. She removed her badge from her neck and set it on the table. The plastic was warm from her body. It landed with a small click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. The locker was in the staff room on the 2nd floor. She stood and watched as the security officer opened it with a key she'd surrendered. Her extra scrubs came out first. Her stethoscope. The coffee mug from a conference 3 years ago. And then the officer reached to the back, to the bottom, where she'd kept them hidden because they were the only physical proof that the woman they were erasing had actually existed. The worn combat boots. The leather cracked from salt spray and desert heat. The laces frayed. The sole of the right boot had separated slightly from the heel. She'd walked 14 miles in them after an extraction in Ramadi that had gone sideways. She'd carried a bleeding Iraqi child in her arms for those 14 miles because sometimes there were no helicopters and sometimes you just had to walk. The officer placed them in a cardboard box with everything else. "Those are the last thing," she said. Natalie took the box. It weighed almost nothing. The heaviest things always do. 2 weeks later, she sat in a waiting room at the VA hospital in the southern part of Norfolk. The fluorescence overhead emitted a low hum that reminded her of nothing and everything. The walls were painted the color of compromise, not quite beige, not quite gray, a shade that had been chosen specifically because it would offend no one and inspire no one. She was waiting for a routine physical she'd finally scheduled, a way of proving to herself that she still existed in some official capacity, even if only as a patient file. Around her sat men in worn baseball caps stitched with unit insignias. A Marine in a faded jacket with a Paris Island emblem. An older gentleman with tremor in his hands who kept looking at the floor. A woman with one prosthetic leg, resting it against the seat beside her. These were people she would have once recognized in the dark, the scent of old trauma, the specific posture of survival. These were her people. But they didn't know her. She was just another face in the waiting room, another person the government had broken and was now obligated to fix with prescriptions and paperwork. The rain outside hammered against the waiting room windows. For minutes until her appointment. The cardboard box sat beside her on the seat, sealed with packing tape. Inside, under everything else, lay the combat boots. She'd almost thrown them away 3 days ago, standing in the pre-dawn darkness of a 24-hour laundromat parking lot, holding the box over a dumpster, thinking that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let the past go. That sometimes the only way to survive the erasure was to erase yourself first. Her hand had trembled. Not from cold. From the weight of the choice. And then she'd looked at the boots, really looked at them, and remembered the child she'd carried 14 miles. She'd remembered the medical bay in a compound where she'd treated insurgents and civilians with the same hands, saving lives that would go back and kill Americans, and she'd done it anyway because that was the difference between them and her. That was the line. She'd pulled the box back from the dumpster and walked away. Now, in the waiting room, with the rain sounding like static on the windows, a phone buzzed. Not hers. But the veterans around her stirred. Someone's head lifted. There was a sound that came from outside, a distant rhythm that grew closer, louder, the unmistakable percussion of rotors cutting through wet air. One helicopter. Then another. Then a third. The Marines in the waiting room exchanged glances. Someone's hand moved to his chest. The tremor in the older gentleman's hand stopped, replaced by absolute stillness. The helicopters passed overhead so low that the windows rattled in their frames. UH-60M Black Hawks. The sound of them was the sound of someone coming home. Natalie sat very still, the cardboard box beside her, and listened to the rotor wash fade toward the north. She had no idea what was about to happen next. But somewhere in the building, a nurse was waking up. Somewhere in the city, boots were hitting the tarmac. Somewhere in the chain of command, a single word was being spoken into a radio, a name that should never have existed coming back to life. The waiting room door opened. A receptionist called a name. But before Natalie could move, a young man appeared in the emergency entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing navy dress blues with 3 gold stripes on his sleeve. Commander Jackson Pierce. He looked directly at her, and then he looked at the Marines in the room, and his voice carried the kind of authority that comes from giving orders that are obeyed in the dark. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes." The waiting room went absolutely silent. Every veteran in the room turned. The man with the tremor was staring at her. The woman with the prosthetic leg had gone very still. Natalie stood. The cardboard box remained on the chair. The cardboard box sat on the chair where she'd left it. Natalie didn't look back as she walked toward the exit of the VA waiting room, past rows of veterans in worn caps, their eyes tracking her movement with the kind of recognition that came from shared survival. Rain hammered the parking lot outside. She had her hand on the door when the sound stopped her cold. Not 1 helicopter. 3. The rotor wash shook the windows. UH-60M Black Hawks descending on the medical center's landing pad with the precision of a military insertion, which it was. Natalie didn't turn around. She didn't have to. The cardboard box behind her contained a pair of worn combat boots, the only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had ever existed. They were coming for her. After 20 years of erasure, after living as a ghost who'd saved hundreds and could claim none of it, the Pentagon had finally decided to break her out of the dark. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, the Tuesday morning incoming trauma was routine. A construction worker, 43 years old, crush injury to the left side, ETA for minutes. Natalie had been reinstated that morning. No explanation. No apology. Just an envelope from hospital administration with her credentials restored and a phone number with a 202 area code, Washington. She'd ignored it and reported to the trauma bay because that's what she did. She moved toward the light. The stretcher came through the doors at 8:19 a.m., paramedics calling vitals, her team moving into formation, everyone in place except the one person who'd been fired just 2 weeks earlier. Except she was here now, in scrubs, hands already reaching for the clipboard, eyes tracking the patient's Glasgow coma scale as the paramedic gave report. Crush syndrome from a steel beam. BP holding at 102. Heart rate elevated but stable. She nodded once and reached for the 4 setup, and that's when the patient's head turned. His eyes locked onto her face with the kind of shock that came from recognizing someone from another lifetime. "Senior Chief," he said in accented English, the words cracking with something between disbelief and relief. He sat up despite the paramedic's hands trying to keep him down. "Senior Chief, you're—" The words didn't matter. Natalie's hands kept moving, steady as a surgical laser, finishing the assessment while her mind rotated through possibilities. The accent was Iraqi. The uniform under the construction site dirt was Peshmerga, or had been, 20 years ago. She'd been in Ramadi. She'd held a field hospital under siege for 16 hours with bullet holes in the walls and this man's blood on her hands. Except he wasn't a man then. He was a child. 7 years old. Shot through the abdomen. She'd carried him 3 blocks through fire to get him to a doctor because the doctor was already dead. The waiting area doors burst open. The man who stepped through wore the uniform of a Navy SEAL Team 3 command officer, and his face was a map of the same compound, the same operation, the same classified moment that had never officially happened. Commander Jackson Pierce. 27 years old. The boy she'd carried. The one she'd held while his lung re-inflated after she'd guided a needle between his ribs in the dark of an abandoned market. He'd grown into the kind of quiet authority that made the entire trauma bay go still without him saying a word. "Senior Chief," he said, and his voice carried the weight of orders, of command, of absolute certainty. He crossed the room and embraced her, a full embrace, right there in the trauma bay, in front of nurses and residents and Dr. Hargrove, who was standing near the medication cart with a face that had begun to pale. Commander Pierce stepped back but kept his hand on her shoulder. His eyes moved across the room, stopping on each staff member one at a time. "My medic," he said. "The woman you just fired for saving a man's life. The woman standing in front of you." He pulled a file from his jacket. Not a hospital file. A military classification envelope, the kind that made federal agents nervous. His voice was crisp, precise, the voice of someone who'd commanded teams in Helmand and Kandahar and places the government would deny existed. He began naming her decorations. Not all of them. The public ones. The ones she could claim. The ones the Pentagon had approved for exactly this moment. 2 silver stars, he said, and a resident's pen fell to the floor. Nobody picked it up. For leadership under fire. For bronze stars with valor for medical interventions that saved friendly forces in active combat zones. 2 purple hearts. He paused. Let that sit. And a Navy Cross. For actions in Ramadi where she held a field hospital under siege for 16 hours while wounded insurgents and civilians both died on her table, and she made the call every single time about who got the next unit of blood. Who got the next breath from the oxygen tank? Who lived and who didn't? Alone. With no backup. With no authority except what she chose to claim. Natalie's hands had stopped moving. The patient on the stretcher was still being monitored by her team, but every eye in the trauma bay was on her. She could feel Hargrove's weight shifting, the way his hand gripped the medication cart so hard his knuckles had gone pale. The mouth that had smiled at her in the hallway, that had dressed her down in front of a dying man's family, that had orchestrated her isolation and humiliation, it had lost all color. The FBI agent arrived at 9:13 a.m. Not with sirens. With a badge and a voice that belonged to someone who'd been tracking this conversation before it started. He walked directly to where Hargrove was standing, now frozen near the supply closet, and held up credentials that made the doctor's breathing change. Senior Chief Hayes was the linchpin of Operation Copper Phantom, the agent said. His tone was bureaucratic, clinical, the way federal agents spoke about classified things in public spaces. A mission so sensitive that her erasure was a condition of national security. Her records were expunged. Her identity was buried. She was ordered to disappear. He paused. You just tried to fire her for the second time. For doing exactly what she was trained to do. Hargrove opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The agent continued, speaking to the room now, but his eyes never left the doctor's face. We've been monitoring financial irregularities at this hospital for 14 months. Phantom procedures. Kickback arrangements with medical suppliers totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. We would have taken another 6 months to build the case. He smiled without warmth. Until today. Until Dr. Hargrove decided to falsify incident reports about the woman who just saved a patient's life by performing an emergency pericardiocentesis while he froze. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. His hand moved toward the medication cart, then his phone, then the computer terminal on the wall. Natalie watched him move like a trapped animal, calculating escape routes. She'd seen this before. Not in hospitals. In interrogation rooms. The moment when a man realized he was caught. He went for his computer. Got as far as pulling up his email, security footage archives, incident reports, the digital trail of his falsifications. His finger hovered over the delete key. The hospital's IT administrator stepped through the trauma bay doors. A Marine veteran named Clayton, tattoo of the EGA on his forearm, expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since the moment Hargrove had first made the decision to bury an exceptional woman. Clayton held up his phone. On the screen, every frame of security footage from the night of the armed assailant incident. Every angle of Hargrove freezing. Every second of Natalie disarming the blade and performing a procedure that should have required surgical lighting in a controlled environment but instead happened in a trauma bay lit by fluorescent panels and the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst. Already with the state medical board, Clayton said. His voice was steady as a platform. Hard copies. Encrypted backups. Everything. Hargrove's hand fell away from the keyboard. He began to speak. Words came out but they didn't make sense. His voice climbed in pitch. Someone called for security but Natalie didn't move. She watched him realize that the network he'd built, the board members who owed him favors, the fabricated references, the outside investigators, none of it mattered against federal agents and missing medical licenses and the particular silence of a woman he'd tried to erase, standing in the light now, in front of everyone, refusing to apologize for being exactly who she was. 6 months later, Natalie stood in dress blues at Oak Creek Memorial's Veterans Day ceremony. The uniform fit her perfectly. Commander Pierce stood to her left. The patient from the stretcher, officially a naturalized citizen now, working as an ironworker, sat in the front row of chairs, healing from his crush injury with the kind of determination that came from having survived worse. The hospital's chief administrator stood at the podium, announcing new initiatives. A veterans wing. Pro bono care for active duty service members. A new director of trauma services. To be filled, the administrator said, by someone who understands that medicine is not about billing. It's about bearing witness to human suffering and choosing compassion over profit. Natalie didn't accept. Not the director position. Not the chief position they offered her 2 days later. She declined them all in writing, in person, with a quietness that made the board members lean forward to hear her. My fight is here, she'd said. In scrubs. With patients. Not in an office. And so she was. Back on night shift where she belonged, where she'd spent 20 years being invisible. Except she wasn't invisible anymore. The trauma bay staff had cleared a space on the wall, a shadow box with plexiglass front and a light that clicked on when you walked past. Inside, the pair of worn combat boots, the only physical remnant of an erased woman. Beneath them, a nameplate, Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Operation Copper Phantom. 1998 to 2018, Valor in the Dark. She walked past it every shift now. Sometimes she stopped. Sometimes her hand would rise to the glass and she would allow herself something she hadn't permitted in 2 decades. A full smile. Not forced. Not hiding anything. The kind of smile that comes when the weight finally lifts. When you stop running. When you remember that staying quiet and staying small and accepting humiliation without breaking, that wasn't weakness. That was a different kind of strength. The kind that held up under fire. The kind that saved lives. The kind that couldn't be broken because it had already survived everything. A resident asked her once, 3 weeks after the ceremony, why she wouldn't take the promotion. They were standing in the supply closet, not hiding this time, just restocking, and the question came out innocent, genuinely confused. Because they don't need me there, Natalie said. She tucked 3 units of whole blood into the cooler. They need me here. The resident nodded, understanding something without quite knowing what. That night, during her break, Natalie sat on the curb outside the hospital. Rain had started again, the kind that fell sideways. A car pulled up and Commander Pierce got out, coffee in hand, uniform still on. He sat down beside her without asking. They didn't speak for a long time. Just sat there in the rain, 2 people who'd seen the worst and chosen to keep healing anyway. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Thank you. She didn't ask for what. She knew. For surviving. For not breaking. For walking toward the man with a knife instead of away from him. For holding him together when everything was falling apart. For being the kind of woman who could disappear and still shine bright enough for a child to find her way home. He reached over. His hand found hers in the dark. Just that. Just presence. Just the weight of someone who understood that the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The impossible discipline of a woman who'd spent 20 years waiting for permission to be seen. Natalie sat in the rain and let someone finally witness her, not as a ghost, not as a secret, but as exactly what she was, a senior chief. A medic. A woman who'd saved hundreds and could finally claim every single one. The question isn't whether she was a hero in that moment. The question is this: how many heroes are sitting next to you right now, in scrubs or suits or construction vests, invisible because nobody's asking the right questions? How many people have you written off because they were quiet, because they followed the rules, because they didn't fight back? Subscribe and comment below. What would you have done if you'd been standing in that trauma bay? Would you have recognized a legend when she was standing right in front of you?